Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today on what has proved to be a very popular workshop. Today we'll be focusing on the development of a carbon removal certification methodology for peatland rewetting. Before we get started, can I just run you through some housekeeping notes? The event will be recorded and slides will be shared with you afterwards, so don't worry about taking copious notes. Could you ensure that your name is displayed correctly? So first name, last name, and then country. And you can do this by clicking the participants window and finding rename. Could you keep your microphones muted during the main plenary session? When we get to the breakout sessions, don't worry, you will be automatically allocated to a session. Could you just make sure that in the break between the plenary session and the breakouts that you remain connected to Zoom? During the breakout sessions, we'd ask you if you could keep your camera on and unmuted. We also have an internet browser. Could you also have an internet browser window open, as well as we will be using Slido polls during the meeting? Next slide, please. The agenda hasn't changed. It's as per the version that is shared with you. We have a lot of content to get through today, so I will have to be vigilant with my timekeeping. Thank you. As I mentioned, we'll be using the Slido tool today. We have a Slido session open throughout today's meeting. Please, could you use this to provide comment and feedback on any information presented? The timescales for this meeting are quite tight, so we don't have capacity to have a live question and answer session, but your feedback and comments are really, really important to us. So please use the Slido, feed it in, and it will be considered and be extremely valuable for CLIMA. We do later on in the meeting have an interactive poll question. So if it was possible for you to open Slido now and have it ready, it will mean that we can move through quickly at a later stage. Thank you. Next slide, please. And now it's my pleasure to hand over to CLIMA, who will formally welcome you to this meeting. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Caroline. And yes, an official good morning from CLIMA, and very big thanks that you are joining in such big numbers. We have like more than 130 participants. At the moment, we had more than 260 applications, so to say. So very happy about the interest. And I'm very excited about the meeting today, because if everything goes well, we should make quite some substantial progress in really getting to the nuts and bolts of a methodology on rewetting of peatlands. I'll start off with some general remarks, and I think then Lucia, Ivan, and Nana will take over and already put out some of the key issues that we want to discuss today. So next slide, please. And this is the big one. Now, this is our big objective for 2050, climate neutrality in Europe. So on balance, we shouldn't add any more CO2 to the atmosphere, because this is what matters: the content, the quantity of CO2 in the atmosphere. With this, we need to reduce the emissions from all sectors, but we also need to get better to remove the CO2 from the atmosphere and store it in our soils, in our forests, the products that we produce out of biomass, long-lasting products, and then a certain share needs to go back to the empty gas fields, oil fields like of the North Sea, where we've initially taken the carbon from. The rewetting of peatlands has a very big importance for reaching that climate neutrality. If you look at the next slide, there I show you our 90% target for 2040. So a net emission reduction target in 2040 that we've proposed earlier this year. So on what you already see there is the importance that agriculture and forestry will have in 2040 to 2050. Climate policy will be a lot about this new bioeconomy. We expect around 850 million tons of emissions in 2040 if everything goes well. But you see only around 160 million tons should come from industry. Because with the use of renewable energy, we should already make a very large jump into the decarbonization of our energy, of our industry. So the largest source of emission in 2040 will be agriculture, emissions from fertilizer and livestock. We expect around 300 million tons, down by around 25% for the current level of 400 million tons. And then that would be compensated by the net removals that we see from LULUCF, but also from technical solutions like bio-CCS or biochar. But in those 400 million tons, out of which 320 million tons of net removal should come from the LULUCF sector, there are already in there a significant amount of emission reductions from the rewetting of peatlands. And this is what we are going to discuss today. So how do we get there? How can we put the finance there where we need it? I know it's a very challenging one because it's a big land user change. So we really need to give the right incentives. And as you see on the next slide, on what we believe very much in climate is first you need to get the certification right, the monitoring, reporting, verification. And for this, we've agreed the framework on the certification where we clearly make a difference between soil emission reductions, so emission reductions, like from the more efficient use of fertilizers or the rewetting of peatlands, contrary to removals, to sequestration that can be in soils, in forests, and are temporary there, which we're also very clear about. Or then finally, also the emission reductions that we can get from livestock, where we should develop a pilot methodology until 26. So, and by 26, we should have then a set of methodology that covers all emissions and removals at the farm, at the forest level. And one of the more important ones is, of course, the rewetting of peatlands. So let's go to the next slide and dive a little bit deeper on the methodology, on the technical work. So as you know, the framework has four quality, what we call quality criteria about the quantification, which we will be talking a lot today, on the additionality, on the liability, and very importantly, on sustainability. So we need to show for every carbon farming activity that there's also a positive impact on biodiversity, on soil quality. So this was a big demand by the parliament, by our member states. So we really use a bundled approach to address the emission reductions from the rewetting of peatlands together with the sustainability. And I think the rewetting of peatlands is a prime example because, like, as for example, the nature restoration law says, is that the full rewetting of peatlands is good for biodiversity. So this is, I think, a very basic condition from which we can start. We will also look today into indicators for sustainability, be it practices, be it quantitative indicators. But I think what I want to say here is we should really look for solid, tested indicators on that. Also, don't forget, this is the first time we do the methodology. We will very likely update it in 5 years, so in 2030 and so on, where then we can, of course, improve the methodology and also maybe add more sustainability indicators. But I think for now, let's focus really on having a solid quantification, a solid assessment of sustainability based on tested concepts. And let's take the best of it to develop the European methodology. on anything else, like the certification process, that we allow for private public certification schemes, that we allow for group out audits when we go to the issuance of the emission reduction credits and so on. About that, you don't need to worry for today. There we'll have also a separate session in September where we'll dive much deeper on all the certification process, as well as then also the establishment of this union-wide registry by 28. I think one thing I want to emphasize is, of course, that when you look then also on our vision for this registry, which could potentially include currently all drained peatlands in Europe, and giving all the incentives from the certification, but also from public support, be it through state aid, be it through the common agricultural policy, it will be so important that what we do here in terms of quantification, the emission factors that we use, will then also be mirrored in the national inventories. Because we also need to give the right incentives for the member states to go there to put additional public money there. So when we talk about the quantification, please keep in mind that we should arrive at a system, at a unique information, at a unique monitoring and reporting verification system that works both for the private market, for the voluntary carbon market for now, but also for the inventories. So I think that were like the main messages I wanted to pass. So I'll hand over to Lucia.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Christian, for setting the scene. So next slide, please. So I just wanted to kind of focus briefly on the why, the kind of context of peatland rewetting in the CRCF. So we know that, of course, drained peatlands in Europe, in particular, are a disproportionate source of emissions, especially in the countries that have got large proportion of peatlands, organic soils. And we know that so far, only about 1%, might be slightly higher as of today, but 1 or 2% of the area that's been drained has been rewetted. So there is a lot of potential. There is a lot of potential for upscaling. There is a lot of potential, in particular in the regions, in the northern, northwestern Europe, eastern regions, Baltics, Scandinavia. And we'll hear a bit more about it also in the upcoming presentations on what the potential is and what's already going on the ground. We also know that the peatland rewetting leads to or delivers scientifically proven emission reduction units. These have been established in the regulation. So this gives us a way forward in the certification. We know also that, and this is very important, and we'll discuss it today, that rewetting also leads to clear sustainability co-benefits. But as Christian has said, we need to find a way to establish kind of solid and tested indicators. We want to make this workable. And then I suppose the last point I wanted to make is really about it's about the agriculture peatlands, which we know are also a big issue that we want to tackle. The message that I got from the experts when I attended an event in Bonn recently was, if you have to use peatland, use them wet. So, and this is where paludiculture and kind of wet agriculture comes in. Now I will hand over to Ivan, who will walk us through our thinking on the quantification, and then on to Nana on the sustainability, and I'll come back to at the end of the presentation to talk a little bit about the next steps. So next slide, please, and over to Ivan.
Yeah, so good morning, everyone. Yeah, this is supposed to be the short version of the note that we circulated before the workshop. So yeah, this is the general approach that we are likely to follow on the quantification. So first, we have to use, obviously, the formula contained in the CRCF regulation, agreed. So it will be, in this case, the Article 4.2, in this case, 2.2, which is the net soil emission reduction benefit, which covers both LULUCF emissions, soil emissions, and the agricultural soil emissions. This is important because you know that in the GHG inventories, drain peatlands emissions of N2O are covered in the agri part, not in the LULUCF part. So we have to differentiate both in the formula. Then the general approach for estimating the fluxes of all three gas are the general IPCC approach of multiplying the activity data and emission factor. Then for activity data, we'll have to develop or assign specific peatland types based on some characteristics that will be used afterwards for the monitoring, reporting, and verification. So up to now, we have these three characteristics: vegetation, water table depth, and peat depth, but it's not a closed list. So of course, very happy to discuss that afterwards in the breakout groups. And then for calculating the emission factors for each of these peatland types, we will have to use a model. It's important here to note that we are not providing the model, but somehow validating existing models. But these models will have to as well consider some specific characteristics, such again, this is an open list: hydrological processes, management practices, and climatic conditions. Yeah, I'll leave it there and hand over to Nana on the approach to sustainability.
Thank you very much, Ivan, and good morning, everyone. I think I will just start with a brief sum up of what the CRCF regulation says on sustainability. Now, according to the regulation, an activity should not do any significant harm to the sustainability objectives that are contained. And for anyone that doesn't remember these by heart, these are climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, the sustainable use and protection of water and marine sources, transition to a circular economy, including the efficient use of sustainably sourced bio-based materials, pollution prevention and control, and the protection and restoration of biodiversity ecosystems, including soil health, as well as avoidance of land degradation. Now, to this end, an activity will need to comply with the minimum sustainability requirements that will be set out in the methodologies. And these minimum sustainability objectives, let's say, or requirements that are in the CRCF, they largely correspond to the objectives that are also included in the EU taxonomy, although there are some variations. So in the context of the CRCF, the sustainability requirements, they have, let's say, three layers. First, we have the mandatory minimum sustainability requirements, which are applicable for all activities. Secondly, we have, for carbon farming activities, a mandatory requirement to deliver biodiversity and ecosystem co-benefits. And these co-benefits, they need to go beyond what will be established as the minimum sustainability requirement. And third, an activity may also generate other sustainability co-benefits, and this should be incentivized to the extent possible. So the methodologies that will be established by the Commission, they need to include rules on of course, the minimum sustainability requirements, but also on the monitoring and the reporting of the co-benefits. On the minimum sustainability requirements, these should align with the technical screening criteria for the do no significant harm principle under the EU taxonomy, where this is appropriate. So of course, now we need to start thinking in terms of how we will implement these requirements and also how we will transform them into something that is operational, which essentially will be key to ease the application of the methodologies. And of course, for this, we rely on good expert input. If we start with the minimum sustainability requirements and the co-benefits for biodiversity and ecosystems, one approach could be to use monitoring indicators for stock of organic carbon under the natural restoration law. But what we would really like to hear today is also if other indicators in existing legislation could be used to prove the existence of co-benefits, and if there are any certain, let's say, considerations to be included when it comes to polluticulture or agriculture use. On the other sustainability objectives, so whatever is not biodiversity and ecosystems, we would, on the one side, need to operationalize the do no significant harm criteria under the taxonomy. And one way of doing this could be, for example, by referencing requirements that are already included in existing legislation. But what we would also like to hear is if there are any good views on which policy instruments could be used to really make these technical screening criteria under the taxonomy operational. So this is on the one side. On the other side, we also need to take into consideration what to do with the co-benefits for the rest of the sustainability requirements. And here, an approach could be to, for example, include a non-exhaustive list of management practices that could be considered to generate co-benefits. And here also, if this is a feasible approach, which management practices would then be appropriate to include on such a list. So these are some of the elements that we're looking at to receive feedback on, and of course we're open to feedback in a written form as well. And I think I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ivan and Nana. So I'll just finish our presentation with giving you a bit of a heads up about where we are and what's coming online in the coming months. So of course today we're looking for inputs, especially on those two quality criteria, so the sustainability and the quantification via the breakout groups. But don't fear, we are also, for the people who are not able to participate in the breakout or for some reason would like to give us more additional written feedback, we have already opened a feedback via survey, online survey, and we'll share the link straight after this meeting, where you can submit written feedback to us by early August. The link will probably stay open also throughout the summer, but we encourage you to give us feedback as early as possible, because all of this will be taken into account when we are revising our draft peatland methodology, rewetting methodology, with the aim of presenting it at the October meeting, expert group meeting. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is just the last slide where, as I said, there will be the link to the feedback, to the online survey, and I just also included the CRCF general website, which has got a lot of useful information. I know not all of you are part of the expert group, so you'll find all information about the adopted text, frequently asked questions, on there. So that's it from our side. So I think we've even finished a bit earlier. So over to Caroline. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, everyone at Klima. We really appreciate that. For the next session of our workshop, I'd like to introduce 3 really brilliant speakers who bring a wealth of practical experience of quantifying emissions and sustainability impacts on the ground. The first of our speakers, Malte Schneider, brings a private project developer's perspective of working with GAST. I'll pass over to you, Malte. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Caroline. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, well, first of all, thanks a lot for having me. We're very happy to be sharing some perspectives of a private peatland restoration project developer. Maybe a few thoughts before we start. So we came to this not even 1.5 years ago because we feel the challenge in the peatland sector is so large, and there's more awareness now, but relatively little happening, that we feel the private sector needs to play a role in scaling this up. Another disclaimer, though, is we are explaining how we work with GAST-based methodologies, but obviously as a private sector player, we're not there to develop the science, but we show you how we sort of run with it to be able to scale peatland restoration. Okay, next slide. So you have a little bit of a background about us. So we, as a AECO, as a peatland restoration project developer and financer, we do the assessment of sites, the development, the planning, the implementation, the monitoring, the sales of the certificates. We are able to provide incentives and support to restoration and conservation NGOs or other multipliers to help us source and develop these projects. We then look for investors interested in a sustainable return to help us finance these. We sell high quality credits to corporates with a credible pathway to reducing emissions. And that then allows us to incentivize land stewards with a share of the carbon revenues. So they don't need to do a lot. They don't need to pay the invest cost. They just participate in the revenues. Next slide, please. In order to get there, because we feel the process is very fragmented, very complex, very few experts around, if you look at what needs to be done until 2030 and beyond, we have set out to standardize and digitize the project development and planning cycle. So from sourcing, screening, feasibility, to obviously making a deal with the owners and farmers, then on to planning, implementation, monitoring, sales, and payouts. We are trying to wrap this together in a standardized process, digitize it as far as possible. And obviously, where possible, we will not do this alone, but work with partners who have special expertise in one of these steps. But where that's not available, we'll need to do it ourselves. Next slide, please. This is just to show how we, as a private sector developer, looking at this, have set ourselves ambitious targets. So we have a pilot phase until next year, where we try to do around 1,000 hectares, and that then increases over time, and hopefully we'll have done or under implementation 100,000 hectares, maybe 1 million tons of CO2 per annum at that point in time. That is ambitious, you might say, but at the end, if we don't think in this way, we'll never get there because the challenge is so huge. We have partnerships in Lithuania, Poland, Latvia, and looking at Ukraine and the UK. We're investing in software and MRV. We are working with different standards, more futures and adaptation. The VM36, and we're developing another one under social carbon. And we have screened around 50 projects and have around 3 under validation. So that was just that you understand our background, where we come from. Next slide, please. Now, this is the first, the next, I think, 3 slides. It's just a very basic summary of how we look at GAST and how we understand it. And then the following slides will be more practically taking you on a journey, how we use it then on the ground. Next slide. So the foundation behind GAST, many of you will know that, but I think it's always useful to restate it. The origin was that direct greenhouse gas measurements on these peatlands is too costly, for example, with eddy covariance towers. So we need proxies for that. I see a comment. So the GAST is a greenhouse gas emission site type. So looking at conditions unique to a site, but I'll come to that. The water level then has proven to be a very good proxy. So there's been quite a number of scientific papers that look at CO2 emissions and related them to different factors. CO2 emerged as one important one. So on the right-hand side, you see that the relationship between emissions and CO2, water level and CO2 is almost linear. there's a little blip in between, which is N2O. And then on the right-hand side, with higher water levels, then again, methane kicks in. So that is a neat relationship. I know scientific experts will say you could fit a different curve in there, but I leave that to others. Next slide, please. So if water is such a good proxy, water level, why do we need vegetation as an additional proxy, as is done in GEST and other methodologies? Well, water level measurements are often not existing in the baseline, or they are or were assumed too costly for the project scenario. Vegetation then is indeed a good predictor of long-term average water levels. So the availability of different species helps you sort of read the landscape, read the water regime, and you can then derive soil moisture classes from that, and they are represented by median water levels in the summer and the winter. You then need to add land use into the mix, and you have all the variables at hand to look at GEST. Can you click once? Then on the right-hand side, you just see, you don't need to focus on the details, but these are a few examples. So for example, moist grassland, the second row, has a soil moisture class 3+, 2+, that translates into the following water levels, as then equivalent to a GEST type called G2, which is assigned an emissions factor of 19.5 tons per hectare. Up to now, 42 GESTs have been described. Not all of this has been peer-reviewed. It's more granular than IPCC emission factors. One thing that is missing so far is there is no GEST types for wooded and shrubby sites, which is unfortunately limiting the scope. Next slide. Summing this up, we see two pathways for using GEST, greenhouse gas emission site types. So the first one is to really look at vegetation as the main proxy, do a detailed analysis of the vegetation form as a proxy for soil moisture class. When you have that, you also know broadly the water level medians in winter and summer, and that moisture class then helps you assign, together with land use, a GEST factor, a GEST type with the related emission factors. The second approach is to actually look at water level measurement, and if you have that available, then you can use the broad vegetation class only as a supporting context, and then you do the actual water level measurements, translate it into winter and summer medians, arrive at soil moisture class, and that helps you predict emissions. We at IAECO, we use option 1 for the baseline because there's no water level measurements often, and option 2 for project scenario emissions because that the water level reacts much quicker than vegetation and allows us to get quicker feedback on the MRV cycle. Next slide, please. So that sort of basics. Now we just run you through how we do baseline assessment. Obviously, that's work in progress or will be refined, but let's go. Next slide. So the first step on any sort of project site would be to look at eligible project area, and you need to do a map of the peat distribution, and most importantly, identify the minimum peat depth and cut off areas of the site that are not eligible. The second step would then be vegetation mapping. Here you can walk along transects with an expert, a botanist or vegetation expert. You actually categorize and classify the vegetation species that you find along the way, and whenever you change you mark that and you translate that into changes in soil moisture classes, and in the end you project that these findings onto the entire site manually or semi-automatically. That allows you then to translate this into GESTs, and this then would be a map of the project site where you see the different GEST types in the baseline scenario, and the associated emissions are easy to read out then. The next step, and that's important, would be to store all of that data in case there will be the need for re-examining or modifying the baseline with emerging science. So you need to have all of that data because obviously after you've rewetted the peatland, that baseline data is lost. The summary here is lots of manual work still. expert judgment, ample room for innovation, increase in objectivity. And we're onto that, and I hope many others are as well. Next slide. So how do you then look at the project scenario assessment? Go on. Here, our first step would be to install remote readout water loggers based on developments that we're pursuing ourselves with a partner to lower the cost. In a second step, we would then calibrate a statistical model to project water level onto the entire site. So at the graph, you don't need to look at the no, please go back. You don't need to look at the details, but you see, can you go one slide back? The red dots are sort of the main loggers, and then there's test measurements. This is what we do in the beginning, but it will be more automatic and easier to use over time. Step 3, next slide, would then be to record these water level data yearly, and obviously project these findings onto the entire site. Step 4 would then again be translating this into GASTs based on the soil moisture, the median water levels. And then step 5 would be, and you don't need to focus on the details, you then again calculate the emission reductions compared to the baseline using your GAST types based on the sub areas of the site. And then you submit that for verification and issuance. Same summary here, lots of manual work, lots of expert judgment still, but we are pushing the boundary there, and we feel that there's further room for innovation, etc. Next slide. Now, I think the most important, and I hope this was helpful to really show the cycle once. This slide then is our attempt to provide a summary of what we think is useful for today's discussions. The title is important from our point of view. We strongly believe that to get to that scale that we need a peatland restoration industry. So the private sector needs to play a role, obviously not alone, but we feel it's important, and we really need to standardize and scale up this. The private sector can do a lot with in that regard. So we can, as we said, standardize and digitize the process, use latest technology to increase effectiveness. We can provide incentive models to bring along, especially the land users, land stewards, but also other stakeholders. We can do the financial engineering to front load the investment costs. And obviously, when we scale, we could also provide data based on the implemented projects and the ongoing monitoring to help the science improve on peatlands. Next slide. But we need science and data to do that. So we need agreement on the used scientific models. There is some debate. I mean, it's not huge, but still, we need agreement on the measurement techniques in establishing the emission factors and the proxies. And what we feel is important is really an updated overview of the empirical data and emission factors for many geographical and land use cases. And finally, we need a policy and market framework that we feel continuously funds practical scientific research to improve the science, so the middle box, act as a practical arbiter of the data and how it can be used, and thirdly, ensure real-world compatibility of this scheme, for example, with a pragmatic view on uncertainties in what we feel is a very nascent and emerging market. So let's not be too ambitious there while we have very small project quantities. How do we practically look at leakage? How do we link to the cap? And obviously, member states, local governments need to improve on their planning and permissioning rules. Then the most important thing for us, though, is that we all together, from different perspectives, should get started and learn along the way. If we wait further for perfection, we will just not learn through implementation. That was it from my side. Maybe the last slide with a little self-marketing. If you find this interesting and want a change of perspective or so, we're hiring and we're happy to talk to you about that. Thanks a lot for your attention and looking forward to the discussions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Malte. That was a really valuable presentation, giving us real clarity on current processes, but also an understanding of where we need to develop in the future. Thank you, we really appreciate that. May I now pass over to Niall? Niall is undertaking some really interesting work. He's involved in developing the SET tool. I'll pass over to Niall and he'll explain some more. Thank you very much.
Hello, Caroline. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Great. Thank you very much, Caroline. And thank you very much to DG Climate and others for inviting us here today. Delighted to be talking to you. And amongst so many, I note in the chat, so many good colleagues and friends, and it's really interesting community, this community which is trying to re-wet our peatlands. I promised Caroline I'd race through the first slides. We're ahead of time and I'll try to keep it that way, which is quite a feat for me. If I could go to the next slide, please. Just to say, my background is in politics, and I'll say straight away, next slide. Next slide. I'm now head of the Aspect Unit in the University of Galway. We're a research unit, and we're putting together a peatland policy portal for Europe as part of the Multi-Peat project. Next slide, please. So slightly changed slide, but anyway, it is what it is. Just quickly, the problem is drained peatlands emit up to 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and that figure is roughly equivalent in Europe. I believe it's slightly higher, perhaps than 5%. Still being quantified all the time. Next slide, please. So the solution, of course, is rewetting, rewetting peatlands is something that's ongoing in many countries. I note from previous slides that 1% only 1% of the drained peatlands in Europe have been rewetted to date. Thankfully, a lot of the I think the percentage is considerably higher in Ireland and places like Scotland, but Scotland, of course, is very much in Europe, but not in the EU at the moment. Just in terms of the 15% figure, that would be internationally. The figure in Europe, unfortunately, is higher than 50% of drained peatlands. Next slide, please. So we're developing this portal, a peatland policy portal. So really what we're doing is peatlands have already been mapped in many places in Europe, but not universally. So what we're trying to do is get sort of official versions of the, of peatland maps to be published right across Europe. And we need that to happen urgently because we don't, believe it or not, know all of the peatland sites throughout the whole of Europe on a sort of, I suppose, available basis to the public. Next slide, please. So quickly, an overview of the toolkit that we're providing. It's a public toolkit for the conservation of peatlands and management of agriculture over peat soils and peatlands, which showcases and analyzes peatland projects and policies from local to global levels. And the typical users, the portal includes a diverse collection of tools, enabling use of multiple categories of user, including but not limited to decision makers, policy makers, landowners, managers, ecologists, and I would also include farmers in particular, and researchers, university people as well. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go into this in detail, just to say that the governance levels, we're looking all the way from local to international level, European level, national level, regional level, and so on. So it's very important to look at policies at every single governance level. We're looking to align policies with the tool. So our policy classification is proceeding at pace. We're looking to categorize all of the peatland policies, all of the policies which relate to peatlands across Europe. We're doing this manually at the moment, but we're building AI tools to automate the process. Next slide, please. So very quickly, what we've done initially is the peatland policies which are there, we've categorized into 8 key categories: biodiversity, climate action, energy, community and culture, environmental quality, water, soil and air, land use and agriculture, research and applied sciences, and economy. And we've mapped them to the EU Green Deal and Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. So we'll move on to the next slide, please. I'm not going to go into this in detail, just to say, when we say, when Caroline said we're developing the set tool, in fact, the set tool was actually developed as part of the CConnects project. What we're doing, we're systemizing the set tool, and indeed we would like to enhance and improve the set tool all the time. But I agree with our last speaker, Malte, that we very much need to standardize the way that any proxy calculations are calculated. We've also developed, as part of the Care Peat project, and I noticed some Care Peat colleagues here today, the carbon farming tool, which calculates the it calculates whether a carbon farming project is financially viable or not. We're developing a policy analyzer and indeed a mapping tool. The mapping tool relates policies to specific peatlands. I'll move on to the next slide if that's okay, in the interests of time. Just to show you briefly our mapping tool. So there's a lot of functionality in the mapping tool. What we have is geolocated peatlands, geolocated peatland data, so it gives specific site types. I want to talk about site types a little bit, which are quite important, but I'll leave that to a further slide. Just to say that the different policies are mapped to specific geolocations. So what we can do is actually see which policies relate to which particular peatland. And the tools that we're trying to develop is the tools which will actually drill down into those policies and provide I suppose the key sections of those policies, so it's easy to find the sections that relate to peatlands. We're doing this in a multilingual way, right across different I suppose languages across Europe, because it is quite important. However, the output at the moment is very much in English, and it's to be consistent, but we will be making sure that it can be viewed in many different languages. So just to say what we need, we have project country data, but we need far more peatland maps from across different countries in Europe. They're not all publicly available, so the call to action really is to make sure that every country publishes a very detailed map of its peatlands and the different peatland types within that country. So they're not all available right across Europe consistently at the moment. We need to ensure that that is the case, and that they're very much open data, that they're open to all different types of research or all different type of portals, because that will actually help with the restoration effort. We're trying to clarify policy data, so we need all the help we can get in terms of deciding which policies and analysing which policies are the most important, because I would differentiate between policies such as the National Peatland Strategy in Ireland, which National Parks and Wildlife Service have put together. That's all about peatlands, whereas if we have something like the National Planning Framework or whatever, or that's not necessarily just about peatlands, but there is a section that's important to peatlands. So some policies contain small bits of information, and nevertheless they can be very influential in terms of what actually happens to peatlands. The Common Agricultural Policy, let's not claim it's all about peatlands, but peatlands are quite relevant to it. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. Just briefly, just to show, these are some of the policies, for example, in Ireland that we've mapped. And what we're trying to do is to make sure that these align from the point of view of peatlands. And that's what the alignment tool is all about. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. This is just a representation. It needs to be made prettier, but it is what it is at the moment. This is an example of the set tool, and the set tool that we have on the site. Basically, it includes information not just about groundwater and vegetation, but various different data about peat, the type, the thickness, fertilizer use, land management activity, crop use, and so on. And we would see that there are many different things are important in relation to proxies. And we shouldn't fall into the trap, in my view, of comparing things like Irish blanket bogs directly with German fens or this sort of thing. you know, when we're looking at the guest models, it's absolutely hugely important that we have adequate data for every different site type of peatland right across Europe. And we cannot be using a proxy system that's a one size fits all, because different peatlands behave in different ways. And we all know that. Anybody who's involved in the peatland sector knows that there's different characteristics depending on the different types of vegetation or the different types of geography, different types of I suppose temperature or different climates, microclimates, and so on. So all these things are important. The temperature obviously is important. The rainfall is important. Everything is important in relation to you know, to different site types. And this needs to be adequately measured and adequately researched. And I don't believe it has right across Europe. So that's something that we need to address. Could we move on to the next slide, please? So this, as I said, is the feasibility and pricing tool, which I think might be quite useful. It's I suppose, a rough and ready tool in a way. It was developed as part of the Care Peat project, and we've systemized it. So basically what it does is it calculates the profitability of a carbon farm. So if, for example, a private farmer or indeed any landowner, be they public or private, wishes to look at something from the point of view of profitability, including perhaps selling carbon credits, what this does is it actually works out whether it would be a profitable thing to do or not. And that obviously depends on quite a number of different factors, including how much it would cost to restore or rewet the peatland. So this hopefully will allow us, as it's developed, to pick the low-hanging fruit in terms of which peatlands are the most cost-effective to restore. Could we move on to the next slide, please? Yeah, so the site emissions tool, I'm not going to go into the details. It's the same greenhouse gases we've all been talking about, CO2, N2O, methane, and so on. So the tool calculates greenhouse gas fluxes. Sorry, I'm getting myself mixed up here. Greenhouse gas fluxes per annum and per hectare, and it compares two scenarios, which is base not rewetted and rewetted scenarios. So just to repeat, we need to standardize proxy greenhouse gas calculations across Europe, but we need to be sure that we have proper measurements for all different site types, because site types are very much a localized thing, and it's very important that we do take account of localized conditions and localized situations. Next slide, please. So that's just a graphical example of something that most people will already know. We know very simply that the greenhouse gas emissions from rewetted or restored peat are considerably less than those from drained peatland. So as we said, over 50% of peatland in Europe is currently drained, and certainly it does make sense to rapidly restore and rewet as many peatlands as possible, because that is very much a low-hanging fruit in terms of reducing greenhouse gases in Europe and meeting the targets that DG Climate set out there earlier in the discussion. If we could move on, I'm nearly done now. So just another graphical representation, land management activity, fertilizer used, and so on. We do think that's quite important. Groundwaters and vegetation. The type of land use is extremely important in terms of calculating greenhouse gas savings and so on. So water table on its own certainly might be appropriate for some sites in some places, but as Malte said, there's many other things that need to be considered as well. Vegetation is crucial. So we shouldn't go down the route where we're cutting corners in terms of proxy calculations. Next slide, please. So the potential obviously is huge. We'd look at sort of base rewetted sites, non-rewetted sites. Obviously, most of them would be emitting. In fact, I think pretty much all of them would be emitting a certain amount of greenhouse gas to a greater or lesser extent. But restored sites, they may sequester carbon from the atmosphere. Good quality peat, unfortunately, is hard to find across Europe at the moment. Intact peatlands are hard to find. Thankfully, in Ireland, there's a greater level than other countries, more because we haven't got around to exploiting them yet. So variables, some of the variables considered would be groundwater and vegetation numbers and types, as we said, animal fertilizers, numbers and types, estimated diesel use and electricity on the sites and so on. How is the land actually used at the moment? Constraints, obviously there's emissions constraints in relation to, the different types of emissions. Everybody, I think many people here will know about the sort of methane problem, that when you re-wet, it does cause a bit of an increase in methane in the initial situation. Animal constraints, water constraints, crop constraints, they all need to be considered. And activity, as we said, constraints in activity are also quite important for calculating proper proxy calculations. If we could move on. And I think I'm just about done. Just the concept, you've seen Eddy covariance tower in the background there. We cannot put Eddy covariance towers in every single peatland because the cost is just so massive. And as that particular one was put in Germany was pointed out, that obviously not all peatlands can we get electricity to, so they need to operate on a battery basis. It's very difficult to calculate nitrous oxide, for example, without sufficient data and energy. So we can't be simply running electricity cables to every Eddy covariance site. But just the point about, I suppose, about the guess method is the way I believe it should work is that we need to have, I suppose, a lighthouse site in each different site type. And I would say that site types should be as micro as possible, really, so that we know exactly how specific peatland types behave. And then obviously other sites which are similar, we can simply calculate using proxy calculations, but we do need the base data from every different type of site. And I'm not going to go through again the examples of the variable data. I've discussed those already. So I think that's it. If we move on to the next slide, I think it says thank you very much. So that's what I'm going to say. And thank you very much to Caroline, DG Climate, for inviting me to talk here today.
Thank you so much, Niall. Thank you for a really interesting presentation and also your amazing timekeeping. I should never doubt you. Thank you. Our final presentation today is to introduce you to the UK Peatland Code, and in particular to introduce you to some new approaches and work underway by the Peatland Code to look at the quantification of sustainability benefits. I'll pass over to you, Renee.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. So I'm Renee Cookfleet-Hermans, and I'm the Peatland Code Manager for the ICN UK Peatland Programme. I am going to mainly focus on biodiversity, but I will start just a little bit on the background of what the Peatland Code is. Next slide, please. So the Peatland Code is a UK government-backed domestic voluntary carbon market for peatland restoration. So it's about restoration of damaged peatlands. And if landowners follow these our standard, they can get carbon credits that can be sold to private investors. So these carbon credits help the companies to become carbon neutral. It also helps the UK to meet the national greenhouse gas targets. And like I said, the Peatland Code is about restoration or rewetting. And the purpose of the Peatland Code is to underpin the market trust and confidence, because without any buyers of these carbon credits, we don't actually get any private finance into these peatlands. Next slide. So the Peatland Code was launched in 2015, but we really kind of started in 2017 at the first few projects. And in the last few years, you can see in the graph, we really started to grow. So we currently have 267 projects registered, of which 98 are validated, and there's about just under 35,000 hectares of peatland restoration, mainly in Scotland, as you can see from the map. Trying to increase projects in the rest of the UK as well. Currently there are about 7.5 million tons of CO2 equivalents in expected emission reductions over the whole lifetime of all of these projects. So quite significant, but it's not enough. So we are working hard on upscaling and getting more projects registered and restored. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this has been covered in the previous talk. So intact peatlands store a lot of carbon, degraded peatlands emit them. And that's the main thing we are currently focusing on a working peatland code. Yeah, next slide, please. So just a little bit on how we do that. So we've got 2 different methodologies for bogs that we find mainly in the uplands and fens that we find mainly in the lowlands in the UK. So in the bogs, we use condition categories with an emission factor, which is based on mainly UK science, and they are directly linked to the UK greenhouse gas inventory. And then we assume a 1-step condition change initially for these after restoration, and then the change in emission factor is the amount of carbon credits we issue. In fens, due to the science, we have to also use the effective water table depth and vegetation to then calculate the emission calculate emissions reductions. And we also in both take into account the peat depth. And fens is also obviously linked to the UK greenhouse gas inventory. Next slide, please. So I've been asked to actually focus on the other ecosystem services. So we've heard a lot about carbon, and that's obviously a really important aspect of peatlands. But peatlands have so many other ecosystem services. A healthy peatland has, but a degraded peatland, it also damages the other ecosystem services, like biodiversity and water quality, for example. So I'm going to focus on biodiversity for the rest of my talk. So next slide, please. So we have started work on creating a biodiversity credit alongside our carbon credits. So how do we quantify that? Just as a side note, it is quite early days. We are in a piloting phase. We don't have it all figured out yet, but this is kind of a presentation on where we are at. So the key components of our biodiversity unit within the Peatland Code are the following. So we are basing it on the Operation Wallacea approach, which is an open source framework for biodiversity crediting, and they're really great to work with and really open. And you can align that really well with regionally and globally accepted specifications. What you also do is you've got explicit definition of units. So the way that you can then calculate that is you have to have different metrics. So there has to be structural or process metrics, and that's about how biodiversity is facilitated by the habitat or the restoration activities. And then you also look at taxonomic metrics. So that's the explicit measurements of biodiversity outcomes from the restoration. And then also look at the performance standards. So that's to do that you ensure the protection or the enhancement of your ecosystem services without diluting your biodiversity units. And I'll come back to what I exactly mean with that in a second. Next slide, please. So the structural process metrics that we are looking at. So we are looking at existing metrics and methods that we can utilize. And it's looking at the habitat's condition and function. And that's UK specific where we can. So we've got, for example, we've got a few metrics in the UK that we are using. And then you have reference standards values assigned to different kind of structures within your ecosystem, within your peatlands. So we're looking at peatlands. The project also looks at woodlands, but I'm obviously focusing on peatlands here. But just to show that this approach can be used in different kind of habitats, but you have to obviously use specific metrics in different habitats. The overall structure works in different habitats. Then you look at trying to scale that, have a scaled values. Between 0 and 100, that's like our end goal. We might not get there in version 1 because it's actually really hard, because peatlands are very different in different areas. But the goal there is that you can calculate based on existing data sets like that, and then it allows you to create a percentage uplift. And that's the main goal. We want to be able to calculate how much you have improved your peatlands based on what it was before your restoration. It's not to go, the goal is not to get to every peatland, every restoration to 100. It's about that change and that improvement. And then I was looking at baseline values that inform your habitat state. So they can be used to estimate the uplift potential is the hope, because then you kind of have an expected amount of units and an expected income from that. And then standardized scales can be helpful for comparison, obviously, of restoration activities, and that creates a more informed baselining process. So really looking how we can standardize this process using technology as well to help with reducing costs. Next slide. So the other metrics that you also need to use are taxonomic metrics. So again, that's like the Operation Wallacea OPOL framework that we're using there for the calculation of a unit. So you really need to look at conservation values or priorities that are contextualized to the UK or to wherever you are, obviously. And the data hierarchy that we are looking at is like we look at UK biodiversity action plan first, if we can, and then we look at more international frameworks. Eventually, the last one is the International Union of Conservation of Science, IUCN. And then the guidance for taxa selection is like really ensuring that the metrics that are selected do actually show the most relevant indicator species to improve overall ecosystem health. So there's a lot of flexibility to make sure that you actually measure what is most useful for your ecosystem, because something in a peatland in Scotland might actually be slightly different from a peatland somewhere else. And especially because you also obviously look at woodlands in this project, you would choose different kinds of taxa to check. But that gives a really flexible decision-making criteria for specific sites. So it's more about making sure that the metrics are correct, and then you can have that flexibility within the metrics about what is most appropriate for your specific site. Next slide, please. So then looking at the performance standards, so that will be checked at project registration process, so kind of at upfront. And this is really to safeguard that you don't that you don't damage any other ecosystem services at the cost of your carbon or your biodiversity credits. So really making sure that you don't try to maximize your carbon or your biodiversity uplift and then actually destroy another ecosystem service. So it really, like, doing it in this way avoids unintended consequences beyond the scope of your credits. So that's obviously really important. But what's also really important is that you don't dilute the meaning of your actual biodiversity unit by including other ecosystem services within the unit valuation. So those other ecosystem services are important, but it shouldn't be within your biodiversity unit. And that's compatible with an expanding nature market, because then you don't have risk double counting of ecosystem services with other new credits that could potentially arise in the market later on. Next slide, please. So anybody who's looked at biodiversity and carbon markets have probably come across the terms bundling versus stacking. And there's different opinions on what's best or what should be done. But just initially, there's a really good paper published by Julia McCarthy this year, and I can put it in the chat later. But it's about what actually bundling and stacking is. So first of all, you can have an implicit bundle, which is kind of what we're already doing in the Peatland Code at the moment. Before we started the biodiversity work, is you've got your carbon credits, and the other ecosystems are kind of the uplift of that are within that carbon credit, accounted for but not specifically measured. You've got your explicit bundle, still one credit, but you've got your quantification of your other ecosystem services. So in our case, that would be carbon credit with a quantified biodiversity credit, biodiversity uplift. Then you've got your multi-credit bundle. So you've got your biodiversity credit, your carbon credit, but you still sell them together to one buyer. And then you've got different types of stacking. So you then have different biodiversity credit, different carbon credit, and you sell it to different buyers. So we've done some market research in the UK, and it seems that landowners seem to prefer stacking, but actually buyers seem to prefer the bundled option. And we are actually within the Peatland Code and Woodland Carbon Code, we are leaning towards bundled to start with at least. So hopefully the multi-credit bundle, because it is less risky to do that. Next slide, please. Then we all know in the carbon market that there needs to be third-party independent validation and verification. It's a really key element in a carbon market, but the biodiversity market is still, that's a bit more muddled. You see a lot of companies that do their own measurements, and they say they also verify themselves. So we are currently working already for carbon with 3 separate organizations, and to do our validation verification. And we're now piloting how they can also validate and verify our biodiversity credits. So to really have that separate validation and verification, third-party independent to the ISO standards. We are currently doing the baseline surveys, and that's being done by a specialist biodiversity company called Peatland. But there are other companies that can do this, and projects can also choose to do their own data collection. The reason why we went with one company for the piloting phases is that was just like capacity-wise a lot easier to just get that all done as by one company. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then a little bit on what we've learned so far about the differences between the carbon and the biodiversity markets. So carbon is a lot easier actually, even though carbon is still difficult, but it's a lot easier because it's a single metric market, where biodiversity is a multi-metric market, and it needs a lot more flexibility. With that, it becomes a lot more complex. What we are trying to prevent is reinventing the wheel. So we are trying to take the learnings that we have from the carbon market, so what works there, and implement it in the biodiversity market. You do have players in the biodiversity market who are trying to completely reinvent the wheel, which might be a good thing or not. But we are trying to not do that and see what we can learn and how we can get this market up and running in the UK as well. Next slide, please. So our current progress on this is that this summer we are piloting at 4 sites, so 2 woodlands and 2 peatland sites. We are working with one of the verification bodies, Soil Association, to develop that third-party independent validation process of these different types of biodiversity data, beginning to draft the standards for the public consultation, hopefully at the start of next year. And we're working to align with other biodiversity monitoring and environmental disclosure frameworks where possible, like TNFD. So yeah, it does. I can't even. I'll pop it in the chat. Yeah, next slide. Thank you. So yeah, that's all from me. I just wanted to highlight here everyone in my team. So both Joe Anderson is our biodiversity crediting project officer, who will join the breakout sessions later on, as will Karan Swoodwooden, our Peatland Code technical development manager. So any specific questions on the biodiversity, please do get in touch with Joe. He is the man to answer all of those. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Renee, and all our speakers. We really value the opportunity to learn from you this morning, and thank you for sharing your experience with us today. In our next session, we were hoping to have a bit of a Q&A session. With the sheer numbers of people joining and registering for the workshop today, it wasn't felt that we could give that sort of full justice. But we do want to get a feel for views for the room. So we have a Slido question, which my colleague Maria will share with you. So we'd like to ask you to feedback to us. What do you think is the most important consideration for developing an EU methodology for peatland rewetting? If you're able to access Slido and type in your response, hopefully, technology working and all going well, we should see a word cloud of responses from the attendees. If someone else has already given your response, feel free to do the same. And as you'll see, it will become a sort of larger text and prioritized within the word cloud. Thank you, everyone. It looks like we're beginning to develop a consistent cloud. No, it's still moving. It's like watching the skies in Scotland, constantly forming clouds. So it's really valuable to see your response to this question. So if you haven't yet typed in a response, we'll give it a minute or so. See, we just have a few more people typing, so. Thank you, everyone. If you're still typing, we'll give it a minute and we'll draw to a close. I don't want to cut anyone off. We're down to 2. I think we'll draw to a close now. Thank you so much, everyone, for your feedback there. Could we move to the next slide, please? And to the next one, please. Thank you. As colleagues from CLIMA said, this is very much the start of a process. Your feedback is really, really important. Is obviously the Slido chat today. Please continue to put views into that. Also, as Lucia outlined, there's an online survey that's available. Following the meeting, we will issue that to you. So we'll issue the link to the survey and also a link to the Commission's carbon removal and carbon farming web pages. please do provide feedback on that survey. There's lots of questions there. It's really valuable to have your views and insight as the Commission work towards the next draft of their methodology. The current process is that we are taking feedback, consulting through the summer months, and the draft methodology will be available in October. Thank you very much for your attendance this morning. I hope you found it useful. If you're leaving us here, I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. If you are joining a breakout group, if you've registered to join a breakout group, we will have a short break to allow you to go and get a cup of coffee and stretch your legs. And we'll be joining again at 11:05. Please, could I ask you, if you are joining a breakout group, to keep the Zoom meeting open on your computer whilst you take that break, because my colleague Maria, during the break, will be allocating you to your breakout room. So it's important that you have that connection to the meeting. Thank you so much for your attention this morning. As I say, please continue to feed in your views. It will all be exceedingly valuable and is appreciated. Thank you for attendance, and I hope you have a good day. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone. We'll just give it a moment for everyone to join back in the room. Thank you for all your participation in breakout groups. I know that my fingers are exhausted from typing so quickly, so lots of really valuable conversation in the group I was in, and I'm sure the others were just the same. I'll hand over to Lucia now for a final word from Klima. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Caroline. Yeah, I won't keep anybody too long. Really, this is just to thank you very much for your input. I think of course, we had limited time, but I think the presentations this morning were super useful for us to see what is happening on the ground. Of course, we all know we need more data, but I think I think one thing that struck me, I think it was from Malte's presentation, we need to move ahead given what we know, and build up the data, build up the knowledge as we do that. Of course, we need to have credible quantification, but I think we do have enough, let's say, on the ground there, enough experience to help us move forward. So I just wanted to thank you very much for your participation, for the active participation also in the breakouts. We will be putting all of this together also with the help of Ricardo, our consultants. And as I said, the aim is to have a draft methodology for rewetting of peatlands ready by October. We will present it to the expert group. I know some of you are part of the expert group. And then maybe just to emphasize again that we do have an opportunity, or you have an opportunity rather, to feed back to us also in writing. So anything that you feel you haven't been able to get across, or you have further elements, there will be a link. It's already open and we will share it. If you can get back to us within the next 2 to 3 weeks, that would be great. And we will analyze this over the summer. So I think the last thing just to say is thank very much to Ricardo, all the colleagues there. Thanks very much to my colleagues as well, all the facilitators who've done an excellent job, and also to all the note takers. And yeah, we finish on time. So thank you for your time, and see you soon.